Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Shop Talk with Stony Brook University's MFA in Creative Writing and Literature program. Today, we'll be talking with the wonderful Roger Rosenblatt. And for many of you, Roger Rosenblatt probably needs no introduction, but I will nevertheless provide one because I was given a job to do, and I'm going to do it. So, Roger is the author of 19 books, 5 of which have been New York Times Notable Books of the Year, and 3 of which have been Times bestsellers. His most recent work, The Story I Am, is forthcoming from Turtle Point Press on April 7th, which is very soon, so something to look forward to during these turbulent times. He has also written 7 plays, and the movie adaptation of his novel Lapham Rising will be released later this year. Roger has won 2 George Polk Awards for his Time essays, and his NewsHour essays have won the Peabody and an Emmy Award. We at Stony Brook University are honored to have him as Distinguished Professor of English and Writing, and I am particularly lucky to have him as a thesis advisor, teacher, and friend. After the talk, there will be a Q&A, and I will be monitoring questions. So please join me in welcoming Roger Rosenblatt.
Lindsay, the luck is mine. In the middle of a plague, in the middle of all this fear and isolation, a talk about writing and the writing life. Why? Why is writing important at a time like this? Because writing counters isolation with community, and it counters fear with clarity, and it even counters a plague with sympathy, understanding, and beauty. On writing and the writing life. The writing life. When my wife and I were living with our grandchildren in Bethesda, Maryland, we lived in the lower level of the house, and every once in a while I would go over to the kids' public schools. We have 3 grandchildren by our daughter Amy. I would go over to the public schools and talk to the kids about writing. And there was one afternoon I went over to Jessie, the oldest of the children, and her class, and it was a 4th grade class, and she was introducing me to her 4th grade classmates thus: "This is my grandfather, Boppo," my grandparental name. "This is my grandfather, Boppo. He lives in the basement and does nothing." I couldn't falter for accuracy because that, in fact, is what writers do. We do nothing. Edgar Doctorow said that a novelist starts with nothing and then follows the nothing through the story. Wallace Stevens talked about the nothing that is not there and the nothing that is in The Snowman. King Lear says, "Nothing can come of nothing." But in fact, for writers, everything comes from nothing. Everything that we do. Writing makes justice desirable, evil intelligible, grief endurable, and love possible. And writers miserable. At graduation at Stony Brook, Southampton, at graduation for our MFA students, I tell them, "Welcome to the world of poverty, humiliation, and rejection." Among the 3, humiliation is the strongest, and it happens all the time. Writers live in a world of humiliation. I was at a book event in Providence one year, and all the writers were standing under pennants with their names on them, big red pennants, and I had a big red pennant over me with my name on it, misspelled. It wouldn't have bothered me so much, but my publisher had put it up. In a Boston bookstore, readings in bookstores are wonderful for writers. Sometimes we draw throngs of 5 or 6 people, one of whom was there just to sleep it off, whatever the it is, and inevitably one is there by mistake, that she or he misread the schedule. So I finished this reading in the Boston bookstore, and a woman approached me, her eyes full of agony and disappointment. "I thought you were going to be Alice McDermott," she said. "So did I said. The 92nd Street Y in New York, now there you do get large audiences, is wonderful for humiliations of a different sort. Years ago, I was giving a reading. I finished the reading and went to the Q&A. Now, the Q&A is an interesting event for writers. Edgar Doctorow, again, E.L. Doctorow, hated the Q&A. Hated it so much that he would time his readings say the reading was going to be an hour, he would time it to be 59 minutes within the hour. So he would stop in the 59th minute and conclude reasonably that there wouldn't be enough time for somebody to ask a question. But I was with Edgar. I was with Edgar at one reading, and sure enough, he finished on the 59th minute. And in that little interstices, a hand went up, and a fellow asked, "Didn't I see you in Law and Order?" I looked at Edgar's face. I'm sure he didn't know what Law and Order was, but it proved him right. I like the Q&A. I like the Q&A part of a reading. And so at this reading that I was about to talk about, at the 92nd Street Y, it came to the Q&A, and I looked around the audience for questions, and someone in the first row raises his hand and says, "Are you related to Yosila Rosenblatt, the great Ukrainian cantor?" I said, I don't know. I have no idea. I looked around the audience hoping for a question that was related to my reading. Nothing. Same guy in the front row raises his hand again. "Such a voice," he said. Again, I looked around the audience hoping for a question even slightly related to what I had been reading. Again, nothing. And again, the fellow in the front row raises his hand. "You know," he said, "you don't look a thing like him. Rodney Dangerfield." I get in the elevator, the operator says, "Basement." Jazz is the art of improvisation, and so is writing in a way. You make a mistake, and I play a little jazz piano, and not that size, but I play a little jazz piano. And when you improvise, you inevitably make mistakes, and the trick is then to make a mistake after that mistake so as to make the original mistake seem intentional. But there's more to the mystery of discovery than that. You start to discover a tune that you've never heard before, never played before, and yet it is oddly familiar. Writing can be the art of improvisation. You search for the word, the right word, and it comes in the sentence, and the right sentence follows another sentence, and suddenly you're off in your own tune. In music, there are three parts of music, as you know: the melody and rhythm and harmonics. But the central part, the most important part, is melody. It is the center of all songs. It anchors the songs. I have a new book out, as Lindsay was kind enough to mention. Oh, lucky me, I seem to have a copy of it right here. Yes, The Story I Am, Turtle Point Press. Thank you for that. I have a new book coming out in the first week in April about just that. The Story I Am functions on the story, the center of all writing. A poem is the story of a feeling or a memory, sometimes a painful memory. I get the feeling sometimes that all poems are elegies. An essay or a memoir is the story of a memory or of an idea. And of course, a novel or a short story is the story of itself. It just tells the story. But everything is story. At the center of all writing is the story. And The Story I Am is just about that. It's about writing and the center of writing, the anchor of writing, stories. Bill Evans, the great, great jazz pianist, Bill Evans always talked about the melody being important to him. He said all the riffs that he would do on the piano, what he called the confusion, we should all be so confused, what he called the confusion did not matter as long as he could get back to the melody. The melody is what held everything together. And that is true of story too. We are made of stories. People are made of stories. It is how we manage to get around. We call ourselves people. We call ourselves a rational species, but that's kind of a shared joke, the way people behave. But a narrative species, a case can be made for that. We tell stories. All our endeavors center on stories. Look at the law. Look at a jury trial. What is a jury trial? But a competition between the prosecutor and the defense attorney to tell a story. Each one tells a story, and then the judge, or usually a jury, decides which story they like best. Not which story is the truth, but which story is the most effective. The only reason that O.J. got off in his first trial is that people preferred Johnny Cochran's story to Marcia Clark's. As the wheels of justice grind, eventually O.J. went to jail for stealing his own stuff. But in the initial trial, it was the story that prevailed. Stories in medicine. Now I wonder, in the atmosphere of the plague, I wonder how this applies perhaps even more. Narrative medicine. Narrative medicine is a field, and all it means is that the story told by the patient of her or his disease is something equally valuable to all the things that technology discovers. And this, remember, in an age where there's never been a higher use of technology. Still, a patient comes in and says, I felt this way on Thursday, and that way a week before Tuesday, and 3 months ago I felt that way. And then the doctor, the physician, hearing all this, makes a conclusion or begins to make a conclusion and tells a story of her own or his own. I will give you this pill today and that shot 2 weeks from today and hope that the story has a happy ending. In business, business is all story. You will hear someone say in a scolding way, we don't do things around here like that, Smith. Smith, we don't do things around here like that. All that means is that the person is referring to the mythology of the business. There's a story that supports the business. In religion, what is the nativity called? The greatest story ever told. The greatest story ever told. Not the greatest thing that ever happened, but the greatest story. And the reason for that, I believe, is that if you claim it's the greatest thing that ever happened, it is always up for grabs. But if you say it's the greatest story ever told, a story is infinitely expansive and mysterious, and that story will go on forever, and so thus for centuries, Christianity forever. Politics. In politics, he or she who tells the best story wins. The best story wins. Why is Donald Trump president? Now, so I'm asking this for the first time, not in exasperation or fury, just simply as a question. Why did he become president? Because his story, however simple-minded, however mean at the center, his story was superior to Hillary's. Hillary had no story, in fact, whereas Trump talked about a wall, it was going to be this high and that thick and keep everybody out, and all the people will be treated poorly on one side of the wall and well on the other side of the wall. But the wall was visual. The wall was a story. He or she who tells the best story wins. And why is this? Because story is within us. It's almost like a biological fact. You see it rise, the power of story, in a great variety of situations, sometimes painful. In The Perfect Storm, you'll remember The Perfect Storm. The book was terrific, the movie not so. But in the book, there's a captain of a mackerel schooner at the beginning of the story, and he is going down with the ship, and there's no question he is going to buy it. There's a hurricane coming. And by lantern light, he holds a lantern above his head and writes something, writes a message, and puts it in a bottle and sends the proverbial message in the bottle out to sea. He had to tell a story. In the last days of the Warsaw Ghetto, the surviving Jews knew what their fate was. There was no question. They had seen their friends and their family hauled off to extermination camps or die of diphtheria or starvation. They knew what was in store for them, and yet, they took little pieces of paper and they wrote on these pieces of paper messages, poems, diaries, little stories, anything that had an expression, that contained an expression of the story within them. Why? Why did they do this? For all they knew, they were cut off from the world. For all they knew, these little fragments of paper, which they stuck into the walls of the ghetto and the crevices of the walls, all these pieces of paper would be discovered by the so-called master race, and the Nazis would look at the paper, laugh at them, deride them, rip them up, and they would be gone forever. It did not matter. They had a story to tell. They had to tell a story. You may remember Jean Bobby. I forget the middle name, Jean something Bobby. Anyway, he was the editor of Elle magazine in Paris. And at the age of 40, he suffered a massive stroke, so massive that the only part of his body he could move, thank you to myself, Jean-Dominique Bobby. The only part of his body he could move was his left eyelid. And with that eyelid, he started to send signals, blink. And he blinked the alphabet, and then people could take it down. And so he wrote a book. He wrote his own autobiography or memoir, just using that eyelid, the diving bell and the butterfly. In the book of Job, the messenger says, "And I alone am left to tell thee, and I only alone am left to tell thee. I only alone am left to tell thee." You don't really need only and alone in the same sentence, but it's fun to edit the Bible. To tell thee, the teller of the tale is at the center of this story. So in Moby Dick, "And I alone am left to tell the tale," says Ishmael. I alone am left to tell the tale, to tell the tale. All of this telling comes from a state of wonder. Writers live in a state of wonder. We wonder about life. We wonder about what we see. We wonder about ourselves. We are in a state of mystery. Every writer asks, what if? What if? What if a young man came home to his kingdom to discover that his father had been murdered by his mother and his uncle? So we have Hamlet. What if you actually put the parts of dead people together and created a human being for some purpose, some ideal purpose on earth, said Mary Shelley. And so we had the new Prometheus. We had the story of the Frankenstein monster. Writers wonder all the time, and they have a great variety of things to wonder about. The wonder of place, for example. It is very important for a writer to know where she is or he is, to have a place to stand on. Archimedes said, "I could, with a lever, I could move the world, but I have to have a place to stand on." My own place, my own neighborhood where I grew up was Gramercy Park in New York, an upper middle class neighborhood. Mostly families. It's much more expensive now, but it was mostly families when I was a kid. I didn't like the neighborhood much. I didn't like the park. It was a private park. It seemed too tame for me, and I didn't like the idea of people being in a gate. So it didn't suit my temperament that way. But one way it did. It was filled with the ghosts of great writers from the past who lived around Gramercy Park. Stephen Crane lived around Gramercy Park, and he wrote Red Badge of Courage there. And Edith Wharton lived there. Oscar Wilde, Henry James lived in Gramercy Park. Nathaniel West was the night manager of a Fleabag hotel, the Kenmore, and he wrote Day of the Locust there, but he also took in Dashiell Hammett, gave him a free room where Hammett wrote The Glass Key, also in Gramercy Park. So the neighborhood for a kid, when I was a kid, being a writer was the best thing possible. And so I would feel the presence of these ghosts, but the one I felt most, the one who tugged at me most as I grew up, was Herman Melville, who also lived in Gramercy Park. And Melville was at the end of his life, and there was nothing in the experience of being a writer that seemed to justify his doing anything. All the reviews were terrible. People hated Moby Dick. They hated Taipei. They hated Omu. He had nothing to signal that he was going to be a successful, much less a monumental figure in American literature. Nonetheless, he walked around the park, and he walked around the park, and he walked around the park, Little Gramercy Park. And some people might conclude that he was feeling sorry for himself, but I don't. I think he was thinking of Billy Budd, which he was writing at the time, and thinking of the next work. He thought about the work. Writers must think about the work, not the critics. Bill Russell, the great center for the Boston Celtics, responsible practically solely for all the Celtics championships in the 1960s and 70s. Bill Russell was booed every time he got on the court by racist Boston, or by the racists in Boston, to be fair. Booed, booed, booed. And his little girl said to him at one point, "Daddy, how can you do that? How can you, night after night, listen to those booing? Listen to that booing. Listen to the boos." And he said to his daughter, "I never hear the boos because I never hear the cheers." It's good advice for writers. Don't hear the boos. Don't hear the cheers. Just do the work. The wonder of place. The wonder of enthrallment. My grandfather came from Germany. He was an artist in Germany, but when he came to America, he couldn't get work as a painter, so he developed a sign painting shop in the Bronx, and he would ride the Third Avenue L, the elevated subway, from his shop in the Bronx down to his home in St. Mark's Place in New York, on the Lower East Side. But a couple of times a week, he would stop by my house, my apartment, my parents' apartment in Gramercy Park, and he would sit at the end of my bed, and he would tell me a story, wonderful stories. One night he came in, sat at the end of my bed, and said nothing. And I said, "Pata," my name for him. "Pata, aren't you going to tell me a story?" And he said, "No, Raj," or in his accent, "No, Raj. You tell me a story. Tonight you tell me a story." I said, "I didn't know any story." He said, "Well, what did you do today? Did you do anything interesting?" And it happened on that day that Mrs. Morris, one of the neighborhood mothers, took a bunch of the kids to Palisades Park. So I told my grandfather about going to Palisades Park, going down the slide into the man-made pond and swimming, but I saw that that wasn't terribly interesting, so I added a few things. I said that there was a crocodile in the pond, and the crocodile was chasing all the kids, and the crocodile spoke with a German accent and had a mustache and chased us. And then I ran out of the pond and then up a hill into a cave where I sat beside a polar bear who was having cotton candy and shared it with me. And I looked at my grandfather after saying all this nonsense, and I saw the slight smile on his face, and I saw he was enthralled. He was interested in my story. Every writer wants to interest somebody in her story or his story. The wonder of enthrallment. The wonder of language. Writers are crazy nuts about language. We dine on words, sound of words, the meaning of words. When I was a teenager, I had this lovely habit of inserting lines from movies into normal conversation. You could imagine what a delightful social companion that made me. People would be having a normal conversation, and I would be waiting like a lion in the brush in order to insert a line from a movie. And the lines I chose were not the ordinary kind, not "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn," or "Louis, this looks like the beginning of a wonderful friendship." No, the lines I chose were ones that simply amused me, such as the line in Earthquake, the movie Earthquake, one of the disaster movies of the 1970s, when the George Kennedy was a cop, and he was chasing a bad guy who was in turn chasing a woman throughout the entire movie of Earthquake. You would think the earthquake would have been enough to distract him, but he was, as people say today, focused. So the earthquake strikes, and he jumps on the young woman, and George Kennedy grabs him, shoots him, and says to the woman, "I don't know what it is. Earthquakes just seem to bring out the worst in some guys." I never did get a chance to use that line in a conversation, but there was another one, which when I tell you, you'll see that you'll think that it was far more difficult to get in, but I did by a bit of luck. It was in one of those Sherlock Holmes movies of the 1940s, which I saw on television, with Nigel Bruce and Basil Rathbone. And there was a couple in a train, and Watson was trying to impress the couple with the greatness of Holmes as a detective. So he said to them, drawing on a case, a citation, "Haven't you ever heard of the giant rat of Sumatra? Haven't you ever heard of the giant rat of Sumatra?" Decades passed. I was waiting and waiting and waiting for an opportunity to get that line into a normal conversation. Haven't you ever heard of the giant rat of Sumatra? I mean, think of the level of difficulty, the degree of difficulty. You have to have not only a rat, but the size of the rat. Then there was Sumatra, of course. But the thing that you really had to have was a situation where you could say this with incredulity. Why hadn't that person heard of it? It was as if it were common knowledge. Haven't you ever heard of the giant rat of Sumatra? Then one day I was working at the Washington Post, and I went out with some friends for lunch. And it happened to be the 50th anniversary of the creation of Mickey Mouse. And I was barely paying attention to the conversation, and then one guy at the table says, "Has there ever been a bigger rodent?" The wonder of place, the wonder of enthrallment, the wonder of language, the wonder of ambiguity, of things that don't quite fit together. writers live in a world of uncertainty. It is a very dangerous thing when we get too certain about things, when anybody gets too adamant or certain about things. But we dwell quite comfortably in a world of uncertainty. And all art may be said to give shape to ambiguity, to give shape to uncertainty. That applies to the physical arts as well as to writing. It applies to music as well, to give shape to ambiguity. We dwell in wonderment of place, of enthrallment, of language, of process. Students ask me what to write or how to write, or they're stalled, or they're in a funk or something. And I say, don't think about it. Go out in a kayak, or go for a bike ride, or go for a run, anything where your mind might be cleared, and it will come to you. It will come to you, usually in the form of an image. Whatever you write, an image will come to you. I do not know how this happens. It is one of the strangenesses of writing, one of the mysteries of writing. But I am sure of it, as I'm sure of my own experience and that of many others. Whatever you write will come to you. It's a Richard Wilbur poem that says exactly that. And the wonder of nature, of course, and the wonder of invisible things. We live with invisible things. Writers live with invisible things all the time. And there are three levels of invisibility: what the writer sees that the reader does not, what the reader sees that the writer does not, and that what neither of them sees. What the writer sees that the reader does not, what the writer sees is the earlier drafts, the things that she or he did that are under the surface, as if in a painting, like Pentimento, under the surface, but are still in the text. You might be interested, take a look at the first editions, or the first drafts, rather, of The Great Gatsby, and you'll see such differences. First of all, there were two green lights, and they went to a baseball game, of all things, in the middle of the novel. And the narrator was called Bud, which he was not called. Nick Carraway was not called in the novel. And then it all changes. The writer sees those things, and also sees the clues that she or he plants in the book. What the reader sees that the writer does not is her or his own life. Writers send things out. We send things out. We have no idea who's going to pick them up or read them. We do not know the lives of the people whom we address, but they know those lives. One thing I try to teach my students is trust the reader. The reader wants to do the work. And part of the work the reader does is to bring her life or his life to whatever is being read. So the reader sees what the writer does not. And then there's a whole world in which neither of them sees what is going on. And that's the world of the most serious, sorry. I was looking for my phone, and I ought to be smoother than this, but I don't know why I can't find it. Hang on one sec. Nope. I may for all this, I may rely on Lindsay at some point. We were talking about what is invisible and what we don't see. And Seamus Heaney talked about things that he did not see, that he felt the presence of a hand. I think he felt the presence of God guiding his hand to write the poem. You don't have to believe in God to feel the mystery, to know that something will lead you somewhere to a conclusion in what you write, these invisible forces. And where we get the invisible forces is through the imagination. And imagination is our key, our business in writing. I wanted to find out about the imagination, so I was down at NIH at one point, and I asked them, asked the scientists there, does the imagination exist? And they said, absolutely, it exists, but we can't tell where. It doesn't exist in any part of the brain that we can identify. And one can conclude from this that the imagination imagines itself, that it is so big that it occupies everything in the brain. There are levels of the imagination. If you want to have the simplest level, there's Mr. Ed, the talking horse. Let's have a horse that talks, and that's at one level. And then there's the level of the imagination that Swift did, also with a horse, with the Winhams, except in that level of the imagination, which is far deeper, far deeper. There, the horse, the Winhams, became responsible for civilization. They're the noble steed. And yet there's a third level of the imagination, and that is the imagination that imagines a better world, an improved world. And that imagination we would like to apply to ourselves now. So why talk about writing now? Because in this time of fear and this time of isolation, writing deals with fear and takes fear and puts it to the world of clarity, and deals with isolation and gives it community, and even deals with the plague itself, as I said at the start, deals with the plague itself and presents life with understanding and sympathy and beauty. And now the reason I was looking for my phone is that I wanted to play John Lennon starting to sing Imagine, because I wanted us to end singing together as a group, a large group, I hope, singing Imagine, but I can't find my phone. Lindsay, I now turn to you if I can. Do you have your phone?
I do.
Could you look up John Lennon sings Imagine? Play it.
I could.
And then you and I can start to sing, and maybe all our friends who are patient enough to listen to incompetent me could listen and sing along with us.
Okay.
Here is Lennon imagining a world improved, and that is the highest use of the imagination, the highest use for a writer as well.
Audible for me.
Oops.
is
Okay.
just,
Have to listen to the ads.
So many great stories from amazing people.
Okay. Can you hear it?
I hear it. Imagine there's no heaven. Sing, Lindsay. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky.
Imagine all
the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and the world will be as one. Now, I didn't hear you, Lindsay, and I didn't hear the song, but I hope the idea of the song anyway got through to the wonderful people who had the patience to listen to us. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Roger. Lindsay actually lost connection just as you were finishing.
I'm so sorry.
But we do have a couple questions.
Can we restore her to life?
Maybe. She might come back, but we do have a couple questions. I'm Frank, by the way. I'm the genius behind trying to get us all to work.
He is the genius.
Roger, Stan asked us, back in the day, you used to give us prompts for weekly readings. Any chance you could do that today and going forward, especially in this time?
I offered a prompt in a letter that I wrote to our students, and I still think it would be a good prompt now. It's a little more elaborate than the simple object that I used to give, Stan, but it's I think it's workable, and it may be something that would engage your imagination, which is considerable. We had good, Lindsay's back at last. Beauty has returned to the beast.
I don't know what happened, but here we are.
I just went ahead and sang anyway, like any drunk in the street. Talking about the prompt, Daniel Defoe wrote Journal of the Plague Year. And it actually wasn't an authentic document. He was writing a work of fiction. But Stan, I would think to keep a journal now of your life as it evolves in this strange, terrifying time would be a valuable thing for you and perhaps your family. That's the prompt. Keep a journal of the plague year.
Okay. So yes, I hope that people are putting their questions for Roger in the comments on the sidebar as you're watching. We have some questions already coming in. So let's see. This question comes from Alex Leo. And Alex says, the lesson of that early experience with your grandfather in which you took a true story from your life and embellished it, is it something you found useful when writing novels?
Yes, I'm a very, very bad liar in life, but I'm not bad in fiction. And so it was, in a sense, the first of the lies that then would elaborate themselves. So that in a novel, I found it quite easy just to make stuff up.
Well, we all do, right? What about, actually, I have a question. I was wondering, so you're someone who has written a lot across a wide variety of genres. And I was wondering about when you get an idea, I guess, kind of what that looks like. Do you know right away what form it's going to take? Like, oh, that's a poem, or that's a short story, or that's a play? Or do you just kind of go with it?
It's a wonderful question and something I've never thought of, but oddly enough, it seems to establish or demand its own form. I had meant to say something in the body of the talk, which I can say now. Alan and Marilyn Bergman, the wonderful lyricists who wrote The Way We Were and What Are You Doing the Rest of Your Life? Alan's a friend. And he told me once that for lyrics, what he does is he hears the words in the music. And I realized, partly because I play piano, I hear the music in the words. And so the music, Lindsay, winds up sort of demanding what kind of form it takes, what kind of song it takes. I suppose the analysis would be, or the analog would be an opera for a novel and a ditty for a limerick, if I were to write a limerick, or a poem, or a piece of poetic prose, which I tend to specialize in now, in terms of writing extended essays. But I do hear the music in it, and then the music seems to then carry me to the form that I use. But I can't be more specific about it, and I realize it sounds vague, but it is the way I work.
Well, I mean, sometimes we're not entirely sure, I guess, but we have to talk about metaphors with metaphors. But Dorothy Hom has a question, and Dorothy says, thanks so much, Roger. By chance, I started reading the Decameron, having no idea it was written in 1348 by Giovanni Boccaccio after the conclusion of the Black Death. What a diversion. Thoughts?
Yeah, the Decameron was written in the middle of a plague. King Lear, I think, was written in a plague. The small consolation, because these plagues were devastating. If you ever read of what the plagues did to Europe, it would make us tremble now. How many millions and millions were killed? People survived. Eventually survived. The plague did its terrible, devastating damage and then left. Surely, at this time, love in the time of cholera, for example. There is always a way. In every grief, beauty intrudes. In every time of difficulty, beauty intrudes. It is almost an accident of the way our minds work, and it's a miraculous accident. And as fearful as we get, and this is a time for fear, to be sure, there is a moment in which art will insist on itself. It is that, in fact, the reason for my giving this little talk on writing and the writing life in the midst of this plague, because it is a moment where I think we could find love in a time of cholera.
Yeah. I've never seen that, but I think I will soon. A question from Wally Marzano-Lesnevich, who would like to know, how do you keep writing in the middle when you're unsure of what the hell you're doing?
In the middle of what, Wally? He's your husband,
would imagine,
Lindsay, so you might as well ask him.
I would imagine when you're in the middle of writing something, you're halfway through and you're
Oh,
just
yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh
yeah,
my God.
yeah. This happens all the time. It's whether I was writing a novel or I just finished a little book of segments of essays called Cold Moon, and I didn't know where that was going to end. I didn't know where Lapham Rising was going to end. I didn't know where Thomas Murphy was going to end. And I don't want to know where it's going to end. I don't like to think ahead too much. I like to do just what Edgar Doctorow says: think as far as the headlights show in the car and no farther. But there does come a point in the middle where you've hit in the middle of something where it's either impatience or some desire to say, look, you've got to see an end to this, otherwise it'll go on forever. At that point, my mind o'erleaps everything that would go from the middle to the end, and I write the ending. So sometimes when I feel what the middle of something is, and I think other writers may do this too, I sense what the ending is going to be, and I write the last pages. It isn't always the same. When I get to those last pages, I may make some changes. But surprisingly, I don't make that many changes. I know where it should end because I've been propelled up to a certain point, propelled up to the middle, and then I take the jump like a high jump or a distance jump to a long jump rather. To the end of the piece, and then right from the middle to that ending.
Okay. I just have one more question. And then I think if our viewers don't have any more, we will wrap things up. But I was wondering if there are any books or poems or movies or plays, anything that you have turned to particularly during this time.
I would like to say that I turn to Camus' The Plague because I know that it is the thing to turn to now. I have not done that. Perhaps I should have. I don't turn for solace to literature in this time as much as I do to music. And I tend to play a lot of piano now just to get the sound of things in the air. But it's a wonderful thing to do, and I admire those and applaud those who find something in a poem or in an essay or memoir or novel or short story or collection of short stories that they can turn to. I always turn to Nabokov in some sense not because he will say anything that will carry you through a difficult time. Often he was the one who created the difficult times. But because as a stylist, he would remind you of how beautiful language can be. How beautiful language can be. And I believe that. I depend on language. All writers depend on language. And in a time when the worst thing that could happen to us is a self-defeating silence, I like to turn to something that reminds me of the beauty of language or the beauty of sound, like playing piano, and hope that art can carry us through this.
Yes, I think it can. I think it can. Well, thank you, Roger, and thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in and for your questions. And please tune in to our future shop talks in the future. There will be others. And everyone at Stony Brook University, thanks you very much. And we hope you have a wonderful day and stay safe and healthy.